third one in a day because, boredom. And what better to do than study? So here I am. Macroeconomics for Dummies. Part, I believe, 5. Starting on page 50 with a section titled Going Both Short and Long in Macroeconomics. As noted earlier, it is somewhat natural to envisage the potential or trend GDP path. Trend GDP path. Basic terminology. Based as it is on supply side considerations as reflecting the long run equilibrium in which all variables can adjust to equate demand fully with that supply. That was a weird sentence. I'm going to read it again. It's also a long sentence. As noted earlier, it is somewhat natural to envisage the potential or trend GDP path based on its supply side considerations as reflecting the long run equilibrium in which all variables can adjust to equate demand fully with the supply. I'm assuming it goes further in depth on that sentence later on, so I'm going to get to that. Likewise, it is easy to think of recessions and slow recoveries as reflecting a short run in which various constraints make it impossible for consumers and businesses to make such adjustments. Excess supply in particular, unemployment, labor, and capital are the results. The question then is, what are those constraints and where do they come from? I know something with this book is that even if the first paragraph like this makes zero sense, after the next 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 paragraphs, all of a sudden it starts becoming obvious. Because macroeconomics really came of age in the wake of the Great Depression, essentially a 10-year departure from the trend in which real GDP was for a time more than a third below its potential and unemployment reached 25%. It is natural that much early macroeconomic analysis focused on the short run. How could the economy get into such a fix? And how could policy help it get out? This is certainly the perspective taken by John Maynard Keynes' path-breaking volume, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. That's the name of the book, of course. The book that in many ways started macroeconomics as an important subdiscipline of economics overall. Just based off memory, I believe that John Maynard Keynes' theory of economics is, I think, one where the government should step in and help things, which really is kind of obvious considering the timing he wrote it during the Great Depression, which I didn't learn until now. Just something that gets noted later on in almost any economic study. Stuff like that, the invisible hand theory, Keynes' economics. These are just some facts that most economists know of. In focusing on the short run, though the underlying anchor of the long run analysis was often left out. In other words, less attention was paid to making the short run analysis consist with the long run model. A somewhat bifurcated approach to macro then emerged. In some purposes, economists found on understanding the growth in potential GDP and what policies would best foster this growth. For other purposes, the focus was on behavior in the short run when disequilibrium might rule. Essentially, a disequilibrium in the labor market with excess supply of unemployed workers. It's obvious that they're more focused on themselves in the Great Depression, but here I am repeating myself. As a practical matter, modeling the short run as a disequilibrium meant developing relations or equations. I don't know why I did the finger quotes, it was just in parentheses. That did not fully embody the rationale. Optimizing behavior that underlines the long run model, it often meant deriving relations that capture the broad behavioral regularities of aggregate variables. For example, macroeconomists developed models of total household consumer spending or business investment spending based on simple historical relationships. Rather than trying to model the optimizing rational behavior of individuals in each group and then working out the equilibrium they might imply, the justification in part is that those aggregate results from the interactions of millions of individual agents, each of whom may have very different terms in objectives and constraints, trying to work out optimal behavior for each and put it all together to describe the macroeconomy is not possible. In some ways, it smacks more of microeconomics than macroeconomics. One moment. Back on. Just some. Okay, now I think I'm going to go back to recording. This section, it's throwing a lot of jargon out there that I don't fully understand. I'm assuming you, the watcher, don't understand either. Assuming it's not just me who's going to come back and watch these. I accidentally closed it without a bookmark. This seems less like more information this doesn't seem like information we should be focused on too much as of now. I get the impression we'll probably be understanding it by page 300 if I get that far. This is a big book. But this is just mostly talking about the history of macroeconomics and how we became a study. Household stuff. I'm not the only one in the household this time. So I'm going to get back to this with the last paragraph of the section. The weakness of this approach is that, as physicists recognize, having two models can be a drag. In macro, having two models can be a drag. In macro, it runs the risk that the story we tell about short-run analysis is inconsistent with the one we tell in long run. To be sure, a fetish for consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. But the problem is bigger than that. Policies adopted based on the short-run analysis may have very different effects in the long run. And model predictions of short-run outcomes may themselves go wrong if the model doesn't allow consumers and business to optimize rationality over a reasonably long horizon. This is especially important with respect to exceptions being rational agents are forward-looking. Their actions today reflect their expectations of what the future will bring. For example, we might think a tax cut will lead consumers to spend more today, but it might not if those consumers anticipate that the government will later have to raise taxes to offset the current tax cut. In that case, they may just save today's tax cuts so as to have the money to pay those higher taxes down the line. Okay, facing back to say. So, this section went through a lot of complicated words and such. Not really, but like the vocabulary level seemed to be quite high in that. And as you can tell by my age, that's not my level of speaking, but okay, we make it go well with what you do. The beginning of it seemed to be about the history, as I previously mentioned. In the end, it seemed to be like talking about how, because of that, we already took the models we've been establishing and split them off into two. I previously discussed how economists use models, short-term and long-term, this seems to be more explaining why we do that, as long as with some real-world examples at the end. Come back. So I'm assuming I explained it for it completely. Next section. Generalizing equilibrium in a dynamic way. Okay. In recent years, an alternative macroeconomics approach has developed. It is generally referred to as the dynamic dynamic stochastic general equilibrium view. The word I was struggling on is spelled like this: stochastic. Probably mispronouncing that, but to each their own, I guess. Also known as DSGE. They should have just told me that part. View. Here, the long and short run outcomes are generated from a common model that emphasizes forward-looking agents who make rational choices to best achieve their objectives. In the absence of any shocks, these choices then lead to trend or long-run path, along with resources that are fully employed. The real GDP achieves its potential. I won't assume, because, I'm here to teach it, because, big reasons I explained. I previously discussed potential GDP and real GDP. Oftentimes, they're not at the same level. Potentially, GDP is essentially just the average rate we're going up. Real GDP is where we're really at. If we look forward, if we're constantly looking forward and there's no shocks, no real recessions, stuff like that, then we should be attempting to achieve our potential GDP. Drew, can you hand me my laptop? Okay, I'm going to check with this word actually. How many? Okay, so it's STOCH Stochastic. That's a weird term. Randomly determined, having a random probability distribution or pattern that may be analyzed statistically, but not predicted precisely. So random in fancy words. Random, but not completely random, but still too random to predict. Random, stochastic, short-run shocks lead to deviations from the path, not because of any irrational or myopic behavior, but because of more or less optimal rules agents choose to. But because of the more or less optimal rule agents choose for responding to shocked subjects to the constraints they face. Sorry, my younger brother's right outside of frame and he doesn't want to be in the frame, so I'm not going to pressure him. Anyway. But because of the more or less read that sentence, often this is the result of recognizing market imperfections. For example, it is common for firms to have market power. Then firms have to have rules for setting prices. Likewise, imperfect competition in the labor market will lead to an adaptation of rules for wage setting. In both cases, these rules should be consistent with the long-run equilibrium so long as there are no shocks. At the same time, though, these same rules may lead to a slow adjustment of wages and prices if there is a shock. Basically saying, going along with what I previously said about Sorry, burping from like all the drinks I've been having. Ugh. Fingers, so it's not bad. Okay. Going along the lines with what I said about forward-looking, trying to reach potential. These are saying that imperfections may occur, hence being shocks, or the recessions I previously discussed on how it's not always so simple. This more recent approach is thus more general in what it incorporates for long and short run in common framework. The DSGE approach is also more logically consistent in that its predictions are rooted in rationality. Again, this is particularly clear in the way DSGE analysts handle expectations, because rational agents can only make sensible choices if they also rationally forecast the consequences of those decisions. So in other words, they're saying it's hard to be perfect considering we're imperfect beings. And if anyone says they're perfect, they're usually not, and they're kind of crazy. The only perfect person I know is Cell from Dragon Ball. One drawback, yes, I meant this part. One drawback of the DSGE approach is that it can only be made traceable by ruling out important differences across individuals and firms. That is, to talk about rational consumer spending choices or rational prices setting by firms typically requires that there be a single representative consumer or a single representative type of firm for whom optimizing behavior is well defined. They previously mentioned like a single agent that they discuss about, kind of making a profile very generic of how the whole of the market may appear to be and how they act. Ruling out unique types makes it a lot easier about general effects. Unfortunately, that variety is important. This approach will miss important features of the macroeconomy. It's fair to say that the DSGE models don't do a great job of describing labor market outcomes. And virtually all of them leave the role of money in financial markets largely out of picture. That doesn't look very good in the wake of recent recession that was generated by the financial panic of 2007 to 2008. Okay. Next section. No section. One moment. Get back. This new section. Staying with the short run, long run distinction. For the most part, this book adopts a more traditional approach of analyzing the long run and short run somewhat separately. There are a number of reasons for this. First and foremost, with some updating, this is the approach that underlies the most current textbooks in virtually all policy discussions. Next time I record this, he's never allowed in the same room as me. Second, the updating is important. In many ways, the traditional analysis of the short run now reflects optimizing behavior. In a rough way, it also consistent with long-run equilibrium behavior. The match is not perfect, but it works reasonably well. I don't know about you, but like, you know that moment where you just goes in one ear, out the other? That happens. I'm going to read it again. Second, the updating is important. In many ways, the traditional analysis of the short run now does reflect optimizing behavior. In a rough way, it also consistent with long-run equilibrium behavior. The match is not perfect, but it works reasonably well. More talking about their teaching method, actually. That's why I just blanked for a moment. Thus, the distinction between the two approaches is less than it may first seem. Indeed, some of the constraints that the DSGE model assumes about firms optimization behavior are themselves not derived from the model but imposed by arbitrary assumption. Because these constraints are only really binding in short run, this means that the DSGE approach suffers from some of the same weaknesses as the more traditional analysis. In setting up a short run that is different from the long run, to put it somewhat differently, the updated traditional view can deliver many of the same insights of the DSGE approach. And by the way, it's a good deal easier too. Yet another section that spews out a lot of information, all just to get at a simple point. They're more just trying to explain why they're talking, why in the book they're going about the way that they're teaching information. They give out some weaknesses it has and some counterpoints it also has. Just checking my lips are purple from all the pomegranate juice. Ooh, next big section. See, there's sections like this. It's kind of small. And there's big sections. So fancy. So big. I'm going crazy. Anyways, macroeconomists are a brave bunch. Trying to understand and forecast a multi-trillion-dollar economy is a daunting task. Full disclosure, though, doing the hard work and risking looking foolish doesn't generate big bucks. No bitterness there. But if you're reading the book to help you get rich, you're likely to be disappointed. I'm personally just reading the book because I want to have the knowledge, so I'm not. Well, even macroeconomics, its principles derive of microeconomics, and having the knowledge rarely ever hurts. I intend to help with it from future endeavors of my own. I'm not so sure as what those endeavors will be, so I'm still trying to learn other stuff that could help me narrow it down further. So, however, knowing some macroeconomics can enrich your life in other ways. Most noticeably, it can make you an informed consumer of political debate. Surprisingly, perhaps, even a little macro knowledge may make you better informed than a number of policy officials and political office holders. Then former Texas Governor Rick Perry called the Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke's monetary policy almost treacherous. Just about every sound macroeconomist agreed that NYU's Mark Gentler's that the politicians' ignorance about monetary policy is stunning. Okay, just talking about how essentially you can have it for bragging rights, I guess. Give the impression of someone with. This is written by two people with PhDs. Shouldn't they do a better job selling the idea of it? And I think I did a better job selling it, the idea of studying this than they did. Hedrick, what did you think about it? The way that they sold it, the idea.
I was not paying attention to a single thing, dude.
Okay, so never mind. Okay, keeping an eye on growth. The rule of 70 is compelling. Compound growth implies large gains over relatively short periods for even small growth rates. Thus, annual GDP growth of even 2.5% a year will mean quadrupling its production in just 56 years. If the population increased at 1% per year, living standards will have more than doubled. The implication is clear. A good macroeconomic policy for the long run must be one that fosters or at least does not impede long run growth. What might such a policy look like? Rule of 70. I think they talked about previously. They did. I'm not thinking they actually did. I'm curious on it. Okay, Rule 70. This rule says that the number of years it takes to double is equal to 70 divided by the annual growth rate. For example, if an economy grows at 2% a year, it takes about 35 years to double in size. But if it's able to increase its growth rate to 3% a year, the economy doubles in only 23 years and 4 months. On the fiscal side of government, that is, taxes and spending, it probably means first and foremost running a sustainable budget. This does not mean that the budget has to be balanced every month or every week. Very few households and businesses run balanced accounts over such short intervals. And there is no reason that the government should either. Even a requirement that the budget be balanced each year would be arbitrary. Remember, debt is a stock. Deficits are the flow of new debt that adds to the stock. Of course, not stocks like shares in a company. This is just an economist version of stock. Stock is a generic term given many different meanings depending on what context it is. Where long-run sustainable budgetary policy really requires is that the ratio of the government debt held by the public not rise to unlimited amounts relative to the GDP. Why? Because whether it pays the principal or not, the government has to collect at least enough taxes to service the debt interest. Otherwise, it will default, as in be bankrupt. As the debt to GDP ratio grows very large, the ability to collect enough taxes to avoid default becomes questionable because it's the GDP that serves as the tax base. At a 5% interest rate, for example, the debt to GDP value of 1 means that the taxes equal to 5% of the GDP must be collected just to pay the debt interest. That leaves very little for all other things: defense, education, transportation, and safety net programs that governments typically do. Obvious. Don't go into too much debt you can't pay for it. I say obvious, but so many people fall for that trap. Often economists look at the primary deficit. This is the deficit in spending over tax revenue, not counting spending on debt interest. As long as nominal GDP growth, real growth plus the inflation rate, exceeds the debt interest rate, a regular primary deficit can exist without destroying sustainability. But as the debt to GDP ratio climbs higher, credit market pressure drives the interest rate higher, and sustainability becomes more suspect. When that happens, primary deficits must turn to surplus to ensure sustainability. These debt dynamics help explain why the Stability and Growth Pact of the European Union specified that each member's country debt to GDP ratio approach 60% as a maximum, and why UK's government's golden rule for fiscal policy specified that the debt to GDP ratio be the same as the end of the business cycle at the beginning, though it can rise between. By the way, the current US debt to GDP ratio is about 74%, which is bad, but also not horrible, because as historically proven, it's hard to talk about politics while staying objectively in the middle. But in the past, we've actually just inflated away most of our debt, so it's not inflation. I previously discussed isn't a problem if real wages continue the same path, and usually it does. So we usually just, if wages and inflation go up, the debt stays the same, or it might slowly increase just because we add on more and more debt. Eventually, that debt that's massive now may become a tiny little speck in the future. But that's very long in the future, of which we'll probably not even be paying. The struggle then is, the biggest problem with that is just paying the interest on the debt so it doesn't grow astronomically high, astronomically fast. I think I did a pretty good job of not getting too political on this, despite it being just a political topic in general. Why is debt sustainability so important? Well, for a few reasons, such as it shrinks available capital. When government borrows to fund income transfers such as pension and safety net, the funds support household consumer expenditures. Because that borrowing comes out of savings that would have otherwise supported capital investments, the borrowing reduces capital formation and thereby hinders economic growth. Yeah, my younger brother just left, so we need to pause. Another reason is it increases taxes. High debt requires that high taxes be to service the debt interest, and high taxes discourage work efforts and capital formation. Further weakening growth. It also causes instability. If instability becomes questionable and default becomes a real possibility, those financial institutions that bought the debt become suspect as well. Turmoil can spread through the financial markets, much in the way it has in recent sovereign debt crises for Iceland, Ireland, Spain, and most notably Greece. This book is old, like 2000s, that's what I can tell. Early 2000s. Not really, late 2000s, maybe around 2010. So these aren't as big of things as they were then. It also causes inflation. With high debt and high interest payments, government may be tempted to pay off the debt by printing lots of money. This causes inflation or even hyperinflation that damages the economy as well. New section. Committing to low inflation. Just as noted, governments may be tempted from time to time to run the printing press and flood the economy with extra money. This causes inflation, which just happens to let the government pay back its debt with cheaper dollars. In addition, because the prices are sticky, the first effect of the extra money may be to encourage more spending and more employment, which could help government if it happens right before an election. The inflation consequences will come after the campaign is won. Sticky being prices that remain the same after inflation, like I previously mentioned, the debt getting smaller and smaller. The debt isn't actually getting smaller, it's just that the price the debt is getting smaller because the price is staying the same, but inflation is going up. The debt doesn't get bigger with inflation. Good. It only gets bigger because of interest. Bad. In short, there are a number of reasons why the government's committed to keeping inflation low may be questioned. Why is that important? Again, this takes us back to the issue of expectations. If households and businesses begin to suspect that the government wants to increase inflation from, say, 2% to 5%, they'll begin to work that into their financial calculations. As a result, workers will demand higher wages increases, and firms will want to raise their prices. The expectation of more inflation thus leads to more inflation by itself. If that happens, the government may be forced to print the extra money that supports the price pressures. The expectation of inflation thus generates inflation pressures. Back with what Theodore Roosevelt said, the only thing to fear is fear itself. Fear itself is what's causing all these issues, or could cause all these issues. It probably has, although I can't think of any particular examples. You could probably look at the history of a lot of developing economies and failed economies. Such possibilities are why virtually every developed country central bank has adopted some form of inflation target as part of its official monetary policy. In the US, the target rate is 2%. Just a lot of do not drink a lot and talk a lot right after. I'm drinking so I can talk anyways, so it doesn't work. Anyways, Most countries have adopted a similar target. The idea to establish a commitment to low inflation that prevents the self-fulfilling inflation cycle from emerging. If everyone knows that the government is committed to a low 2% inflation, the knowledge acts as a check on people's expectations. Like the commitment to a sustainability budgetary policy, this too fosters growth. With rapid inflation, especially with hyperinflation, economic activity can falter sharply. I previously mentioned that low inflation is good since it's spending money now, not later. That way, the economy is still, everyone's spending their money now, so the economy is working out fine. And if everyone's spending money now, everyone's spending money, jobs are getting, like firms are getting money. And those firms give back a lot of money. Most, if not all of most of firms' money usually goes back into investing into the same firm, not necessarily the people, but things that just help make people's lives better. And that could be more employees, which helps the unemployment rate, and by making the company bigger, again, more employees, technology improves. With technology improves and innovating so much, some of that technology finds its ways to implement households. I'm going to get through this section, then I'm going to end it here. Well, then I'm going to end it. Responding to short-run stocks. Now comes the hard part. What to do when an economy slips below potential into recession? As noted earlier, if the falls reflect a supply shock, then there's a little that conventional macroeconomic policy can do. Conventional policy works through raising demand. If supply is truly limiting GDP, no amount of extra demand will help. Microeconomic policies that address the supply shortage, for example, improve labor market matching, may be helpful, but conventional macro policies that raise demand will not. I believe last part I briefly did the slight thing on demand and supply. If supply is limited, no matter how much demand there is, you can't just go snap and poof. All of a sudden, all supply needs are fulfilled. But if the recession is guaranteed by fall in demand, as is typical, then conventional macroeconomic policies can help speed up the recovery. We discussed these policies in more details in chapter 14 to 15, but there will be a quick introduction to the basic ideas. Basically, there are two tools that policymakers can use to rekindle the demand of goods and services. They can use expansionary fiscal policy, means increasing government spending on goods and services and or reducing taxes. Both actions increase the aggregate demand for goods and services, the former directly and the latter indirectly. Households have great disposable income to use to increase consumption. Investments looks attractive to firms because they get to keep more of their profits. Expansionary monetary policy. The last one was expansionary fiscal policy. This one's expansionary monetary policy. Fiscal is government, monetary is Feds. It means cutting the official interest rate, the rate in which commercial banks borrow from each other. The hope is that this action reduces interest rates throughout the economy and encourages consumers to spend and firms to invest. Here's a small catch though. When the official interest rate is at or close to zero, not much more can be achieved by conventional monetary policy. This is what the case in the US for some time. It is commonly referred to as a liquidity trap, to the extent that monetary policy works by lowering interest rates and making credit cheaper. It has nothing left in the bag of tricks when the interest rate is at or very near zero. You can't bring zero any lower until you get to negatives, and then people literally get paid to borrow money. Alright. Central banks can still increase the money supply, though. Even if that doesn't lower the interest rate, it may be that such extra liquidity still encourages more spending. Such policy is called quantitative easing, or QE for short. It appears to be an adoption of QE policy that truly riled up former Texas Governor Rick Perry to the point in saying that Texans should treat former Fed Chairman Bernanke pretty ugly if he visited the state. Monetary policy has two advantages over fiscal policy and demand management tool. One is that it more easily changed. As a politically independent institution, the Fed can move quicker to raise or lower the money supply, and also alter interest rates as it sees fit. But fiscal policy can only be changed by congressional action and presidential accord. This is slow progress and is in the best circumstances. In addition, excessive use of the fiscal policy can lead over time to a buildup of public debt. As noted earlier, debt can lead to sustainability problems and fears of difficulty that can impede growth and lead to inflation. Now, I just remembered, I spoke a lot. I briefly went to things, but, better knowledge in here I get by spewing this out. Believe it or not, that works sometimes. Do not tell that to the one friend who yaps too much, though. Okay. I briefly went over what expansionary monetary policy and expansionary fiscal policy are. You can go over things in the later parts if you're willing to go back. Okay, what is there discussed? As I said with the whole supply and demand thing, you can't just make supply appear out of nowhere, so supply-based recessions are usually the worst. Like, they previously made the example of you're a sugar farmer and you get a bad season and disease strikes. So you have less sugar to sell. You can't just solve the issue by increasing demand. No, you solve the issue by increasing supply. Okay, the next paragraph was talking about, first one was about that. Next was about how demand we can do stuff about it. Okay, talking about how with monetary and fiscal policy, people change interest rates to make people want to spend more or spend less. If interest rates are higher, banks want to lend out more money because they can get more money out of it, but people are less willing to take out more money. If interest rates are lower, consumers and firms, if interest rates are higher, there's a little thing known as bonds and certificate deposits. Basically, banks offer loans that they supply those higher interest rates at. So they can actually help can boost your own money. While lower interest rates also work in ways that if it's easier to borrow, more people are willing to borrow. But yeah, too high interest rates and people don't borrow as much. That's why when the feds come together and drop the interest rate from 5.5 to just 5, that's a really big deal because the 0.5 is a massive leap. Okay. And they were talking about how you can't bring, sensibly, you could in theory, but it would serve zero reason to do so. You can't bring zero even lower. No, you actually have to do other stuff besides mess with interest rates. And I am not qualified enough. I'm not qualified, but I'm not qualified enough to even attempt to go over what the Fed does. And yes, they are very needed, and we can't just throw them out, contrary to what some people may believe. More generally, a key difficulty for policy making is the short run. The short run is how the fiscal and monetary policies are available for a combination of the problems of recession are in opposition to policy needed in the long run. It's nice to have the flexibility to respond to economic events as they happen. Such flexibility allows policy to be responsive and help economy avoid serious trouble. But the flexibility to run deficit also undermines savings and undercuts government commitment to sustainable budgets. Likewise, the flexibility to print a lot of money can undermine the commitment to low inflation. How can the government convince everyone of its commitments if it breaks them every cycle? I'm not gonna say that. I prefer not getting blacklisted from everything. Not to say it's that bad, but like cancel culture, you can easily say one small thing, it can be blown out of disproportion. I'm bending my hand, so it's not bad. If it was straight out, I'd have issues. In other words, there's also a secondary and related difficulty. It's not always easy to recognize the beginning of serious recession, especially in the light of problems of maintaining credible long-term policy commitments. Policymakers have to be careful about responding to each and every little economic hiccup. The economy's self-righting mechanisms may not be perfect, but they will correct minor disturbances, and what may initially look like the onset of chorea might just turn out to be a little indigestion. Example being, their example was like diseases, how, well, when you look on Google and you search up your symptoms, it'll say, you have small lumps on your skin. You got skin grafts. But no, it's just eczema. Which just means you don't have enough oil in your skin, so your body's storing them in different ways. Anyways. Well, their example correlating to the financial services, because one bank failing doesn't necessarily mean every bank is going to fail. But panic about banks failing is what causes every bank to fail. It may well be prudent to wait and see whether minor economic blip turns out to be a major upset that requires policy intervention. Yet waiting to be sure that serious recession is underway can increase the severity of real contraction substantially, perhaps even worse. It can mean that by the time the fiscal monetary authorities react and the policy response begins to have impact, economies may already be recovering on its own. In that case, the expansionary policies may just overheat the economy into the next boom and bust cycle. Back to the whole disease things. Still check it out, because if it's an actual problem and you have cancer, it's best to get that treated as soon as possible. But with economics like this, you can't just check it out. You have to. Well, you can check it out, but usually by doing so, you're too late, which we discussed, or you can immediately implement things and possibly fail and ruin things. You don't want to prescribe pain meds to a patient who just got off of a pain med addiction because of something that looks like it could increase. They might get a disease that might all of a sudden give them immense migraines or symptoms of it. You might give them pain meds without further looking into it, despite there never actually being that disease, just some side effects that came from nowhere. And now he has the pain meds, so he's back with his addiction. That was just me spewing out a random idea. Don't take it too deeply. Don't think of it too deeply, but there it is. Booms associated with financial bubbles create especially difficult problems because bubbles are notoriously fragile. In a bubble, asset prices are high today because they're expected to be higher tomorrow. Efforts by the Fed to rein in the irrational exuberance then can act as a signal that the bubble will not survive far into the future. But if everyone thinks the bubble will pop and assets prices will stop rising on Friday, prices won't be high on Thursday. If they can't be high on Thursday, then the price won't be high on Wednesday, or the price on Wednesday has to be lower, and so on. Thus, a financial bubble can collapse as soon as the central bank takes public visible steps to rein it in. Of course, the collapse will be worse, and the longer the bubble goes on, as the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008 amply demonstrates. This is a tough call to say that the Fed should have acted sooner. Like recessions, bubbles are not easy to recognize, especially in the early days. Sorry, I just had to sneeze. Anyways, recessions are very costly. A lot of potential outputs goes unproduced when the economy falls off its long-run trends because of sluggish wage and price adjustments. But using short-run fiscal and monetary policies to speed up the recovery and minimize the lost production is tricky too. It's hard to be right about the timing and magnitude of policy intervention, and the intervention itself may compromise government commitments to sustainable debt and low inflation in the long run. That loss of credibility can impede long-term growth, and even small changes in growth rate can have large implications in a relatively short time. For more major traumas, like the Great Recession, and the marginal error of large Obama stimulus and the Fed's low interest rate, plus quantitative easing monetary policies, were probably helpful in facilitating economic recovery with minimum long-run damage. That may well not be the case, though. For more common, smaller shocks, in short, if someone asked whether it's difficulty to choose the right macroeconomic policy consistently, the answer is yes and no. Okay, just got through the next section. Chapter 4, on page 61. I'm going to briefly talk about what I just read about. This is 50 minutes in so far, and I'm going to end it after that. I briefly explained the chapters. It seemed like the later chapters were more add-ons to what I explained on. I was talking about how you can't just implement a policy thinking that a small problem becomes big because you think it can, when that policy could damage the small thing by avoiding the big cause. I'm trying to think of an analogy that actually works. Immediately think of medical things because they brought up medical things. Okay, screw it. I'll just say it. Teenagers, they get a small pimple, so they pop it. Well, I'm a teenager. I'm thinking that it could grow bigger, so they stop it before it grows. But irrationally, you're not supposed to pop them. So what I'm saying is, as a example being, if you have the small problem, the pimple, you're worried that might get large, you might implement a policy to pop it, even though it might only ever become small, and there's other things you can take care if it's just a small thing. So that's the example being, and oftentimes that becomes an issue because you can't just change policy, because if you leave it be, it can grow big, and when it can grow big, that's when a lot of the big issues happen. Troy helped me gain some more respect for macroeconomists, because this is it would be very difficult to determine whether things are possibly big, and if they're very big, they'll be very dangerous, and just immediately cut it out short and fail and get massive criticizing for that, when in actuality it could have gone. Anyways, I believe that was the sum. I'm gonna just go back and check to see. Oops. Okay. Oh, they briefly talked about bubbles and like real estate crash. I'm gonna recommend a movie. I believe it was called The Big Short. Yes, it is that. It's based off of the financial crisis. It's a little on the, I think it's like rated R. It puts a lot of light on the corruption that played into it. I really like the movie. It helped describe the actual how the recession, not recession, it was a recession, the bubble pop. Another one, of course, was just the internet bubble, the dot-com bubble in like early 2000s, where people were like investing all their money into internet companies because they were all doing so well, or they kept hearing in the news another internet companies doing well. People buying more makes people makes people think it's, oh, this looks really good, so they buy more. Oh, this looks really good, so they buy more. And then they realize, oh, it's not really this good. Pop. And same way with going down. Although with going down, like recessions are shocking, you can't just immediately boost them back up. And often the pop, it pushes everything back down here. And there's all the employees who were given new jobs because of all the invested money. So it's really horrible. And not easily noticeable. I think that's it for today. The next chapter will go, I'm just going to read, in this part, get a firm grip of GDP and everything that goes into calculating it. Discover what inflation is and why it may explode into hyperinflation, and why a little inflation may be a good thing. Understanding how interest rates are a different kind of price and how their role in savings and investment. And see how employment affects the economy, understanding how it's measured, and figure out what causes unemployment levels to change. Oh, I'm thirsty. Well, I'm looking right there, which also, the camera's right here. Okay, it's not there. Assume the camera's here. The timer is right here. So, like, I'm looking at that. It says 57 minutes, 30 seconds. I'm going to end it here. Rather longest part yet. But finish the whole chapter in one day.